Outside the village wall, Peter bent over an unguarded water trough, splashing his face and rubbing his teeth clean on the back of his arm, using the bristles of his fur similarly to a toothbrush. Taking off his jacket and vest, he went on to wash out under his arms as well. Nearby mice cringed in disgust as they passed. The general consensus was that they would not use that trough again. Such was the scene when Elizabeth arrived, and a very shocking scene it was, for she had never before seen Peter without his vest on. She clapped her hands over her mouth, gasping in horror as she laid eyes on the scars and the bare skin marking Peter's chest and back. Peter glanced her way from the corner of his eye. "Bess?" He hastily dried himself off and donned his vest and jacket. "I suppose I should have expected you." Elizabeth ran a hand through her hair and took a breath to calm her nerves.
Monster said you were leaving.
"At first light, yes, and I expect you've come to talk me out of it." Elizabeth walked slowly over to Peter and sat on the edge of the water trough, dangling her fingers over the side, oblivious to the grimaces from nearby mice.
Up to now, we've all been in this together. Now you're just going to up and leave us behind?
Peter stuck his hands in his pockets and sauntered over to the scale. "You all appear ready to stay. Doesn't it bother you that I can't?" Elizabeth followed Peter to the scale and took one of his giant hands in both of her own.
It doesn't appear we have been very considerate of you,
Elizabeth said quietly, stroking his hand gently as she looked down.
It's been so long since we've been in a nice community.
Peter scoffed and looked away, but he didn't remove his hand from Elizabeth's caress. Elizabeth looked up at Peter's face then.
Peter, I couldn't stay here knowing you were off alone. We've all become sort of a family. Me, you, Monster, and Stu.
Matrix squeaked, peering down over the side of the scale.
Yes, you too, Matrix. All of you mean the world to me.
Then, I assume, you wouldn't want to keep me where I'm miserable.
No, of course not.
Peter knelt down in front of Elizabeth, looking her square in the eye. Then what is the answer, Bess?
We've been invited to supper, and we've been invited to spend the night. And we've already accepted,
Elizabeth suggested.
Let's just do that. Then we'll all move on together, tomorrow morning at first light, as originally planned.
Peter's face relaxed slightly, and he cracked a smile. He patted Elizabeth on the shoulder. Then you won't be miserable if we go on?
For a while, maybe. I'd regret it. But I haven't known Adam long enough to really hurt. Maybe if we stayed longer than a day, it would be different. But we will go before I fall too hard.
Peter shook his head. No, I won't do that to you.
It isn't your choice. I decide what I want to do.
Peter smiled ruefully. Sweet Bess, our lives are filled with comings and goings. Look around you. You have found a safe, beautiful new home. Even Monster seems to be settling in. He cupped Elizabeth's face in his free hand and stroked her behind her ear. Our time together would end regardless of what happens here. This farewell is inevitable. Better it should happen in good circumstances, such as these. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around Peter's neck and pulled his face close to hers. Staring him straight in the eye, she said,
Peter, we are family. Families stick together. Besides, I'm not convinced this is a safe community. There is something odd about this place.
Peter grew rigid for a moment, but as he hugged Elizabeth back, he began to relax. Okay, Bess, you win. I'll wait until morning, but no later. Peter held Elizabeth at arm's length. Now then, you have a feast to attend. At the mention of a feast, Elizabeth's stomach gave a fierce growl. Shame was written across Elizabeth's face as she looked up into Peter's eyes. The rat, however, had broken out into a grin. Elizabeth forced a chuckle, but her eyes shone with regret.
Please don't mention feasts, not while I'm around.
Peter winked. Have an extra plate for me, dear? Elizabeth's smile faded.
Peter, we have a feast to attend. We all go, or none of us go.
This time Peter's smile faded. I'll wait for you all until first light tomorrow, but I will not attend that feast. I can't stand all those furtive glances and the ladies' frightened eyes. In a low voice he added, and after my little outburst, I'm feeling somewhat ashamed. The remainder of the day weighed heavily on Elizabeth's heart. She spent much of it stretched out on her bed, arms crossed behind her head, gazing out the nearest window. The sun drifted lazily across the sky, floating amid fluffy mountains of clouds. Its rays passed over Elizabeth's skin, but could not touch her soul. A terrible weight pressed down upon her as she recalled the first time she had met Peter, the mistakes that led him to lose his own home, mistakes Elizabeth had made. However hard she tried to recall Peter's words to her, Elizabeth's own conscience refused to release her from her self-imposed debt to the rat. She also thought of Adam, of his warm brown eyes, his intelligence, his kindness. She could easily fall in love with him, she knew. Elizabeth felt torn and cried often that day. She shed tears of loss for what might have been, of guilt for having forgotten about Peter, of shame for wanting to stay in spite of Peter, but most of all, of regret for the things she might have done differently. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting long shadows in its wake, and its last dying rays through Elizabeth's window, when there came a knock at the door. She sat up, wrapping a fresh cloak around her shoulders, and hastily drying her eyes.
Come in.
Despite her best efforts, Elizabeth couldn't quite keep the quiver out of her voice. Stu nosed his way in the door. "Y'all coming? The locals are getting busy." Elizabeth nodded.
I'll be out in just a moment. Wait for me.
Right. Stu stepped back out, the door closing behind him.
And Stu?
The door swung open again as Stu poked his head back in.
This time, really wait for me, okay?
Stu grinned. "Yeah, of course." Then he was out again. Elizabeth took a deep breath, letting it out to test her voice. She repeated this several times, working to steady herself. She twisted her mouth into various false smiles and smirks. Then she emerged, accompanied by Stu, and ventured out into the town square. The first thing Elizabeth noticed as she stepped out the main door was the smell, the sense of various fresh-baked breads and hot batter, of rich sauces and wild herbs, wafting up to greet her from dozens of kitchens in the village below, carried on a warm summer breeze. She grimaced as she felt her stomach growl to churning life. "Y'all gonna control yourself?" Stu asked.
I hope so,
Elizabeth muttered. Stu grinned up at her, but kept his thoughts to himself. In the square, 3 long tables had been set up in a horizontal U shape, a grand, towering throne seated at the head, with several smaller seats of honor alongside it on either side. There sat Matthias, watching over the proceedings, with Adam at his right hand. As Elizabeth descended the stairs, Adam motioned for her to take a spot beside him. Invited or not, Stu followed right along at Elizabeth's heels, taking the next seat as if he had always belonged there. Fortunately for him, he had. Adam had made arrangements for Elizabeth's companions ahead of time. As the mice gathered, only one of the seats remained unoccupied, the one meant for Peter. That, however, was quickly filled by a certain young woman who was very eager to take the place beside Monster. Bit by bit, the occupants of each dwelling emptied out into the square, taking up pre-arranged positions around the tables. They were clean, having taken time to bathe and groom themselves after the day's work, and came wearing the finest clothing they owned. The divide between classes, even in the commune, was striking. Elizabeth felt woefully underdressed beside the likes of Adam and Matthias, and those mice seated to their left. A few dozen chairs at the far ends remained unoccupied, having been meant for the cooks and servers. A handful of young mice passed around the interior of the tables, setting out plates, silverware, and cups. They were followed shortly thereafter by additional mice carrying trays, pots, and bowls of food to be distributed amongst the many plates. Elizabeth's portions were somewhat less than she had hoped for, after all this talk of feasts. However, she reminded herself that these mice were farmers, and they needed to conserve what they had for the winter months. Besides, she was well aware of her unusually large appetite, and she wasn't eager for a repeat of the incident in the city. Once the last of the mice were seated, Matthias rose to his feet and struck his cane against the wooden floor. A heavy silence fell over the gathering as the ancient mouse cleared his throat and began to speak.
My neighbors, my friends, my people, another harvest is upon us. Another year has passed, and now we are standing strong and secure in this commune. I applaud your labors and the sacrifices each one of you has made for the whole.
He was met with subdued applause and the occasional hear, hear. Matthias went on.
Join me as I give thanks for our protector, without whom none of this would have been possible.
The mice bowed their heads and murmured as one voice, We give thanks for the gift of Jormungandr. Monster shivered, and not from any cold. Elizabeth met his suspicious glance with one of her own.
Yeah, thank y'all,
Stu blurted out.
Let's eat. And now for a word from Jormungandr's chosen.
Stu scowled up at Matthias as the ancient mouse sat down, and then the shrew rested his cheek against his fist.
Shoot!
Adam wobbled to his feet, leaning heavily on his crutch, to some sparse, light clapping.
My people,
he began.
My neighbors,
he began.
My people, on this day of the harvest, we received an unexpected blessing.
A free dinner,
Stu shouted.
So let's get on with it before the food gets cold.
There was some light laughter and a great deal of very judgmental murmurs in response to the shrew's outburst. Adam, for his part, gave a smirk and a chuckle.
My sentiments exactly. So, I promise I'll keep it short.
Here,
Stu added. Elizabeth fixed him with an icy stare, bringing a heavy silence over the shrew.
Join me,
Adam continued,
in welcoming 3 new souls to our town. Jeremiah Marsh.
A polite round of applause greeted the large mouse, accompanied by an irritated scowl from Monster.
Stu the Shrew.
Stu stood up in his chair, giving a series of exaggerated bows. He was met with some laughter and light clapping. Adam looked down at the woman beside him, his face practically glowing the moment he laid eyes on her.
And most of all...
He paused, desperately wanting to call her a rare gem of great price, but choked it back.
Elizabeth Hartley.
Several enthusiastic cheers went up, all from Stu, drawing another cold glance from Elizabeth. Stu ignored her.
Welcome. Now let's eat already.
Adam grinned.
Agreed.
With that, he collapsed into his seat with a heavy sigh of relief.
Not a fan of public speaking?
Elizabeth asked. Adam shook his head.
All speeches are easy. It's standing that's hard.
As the other mice began to eat, Monster hesitated. He observed them all in turn, the way they used their little knives and forks. Picking up his own, Monster heaved a sigh and leaned back, staring clueless at them, and shook his head. Astrid paused, mid-bite, as she took notice.
Something wrong?
Monster chuckled at himself.
How does one work these things?
Astrid stifled a giggle.
What do you normally do?
Normally, I'd chop my prey open and feed directly from its flesh.
A very uncomfortable look crossed Astrid's face. Then she grinned.
Well, as you can see, dinner came pre-chopped.
Yes, I see.
Monster fumbled awkwardly with his utensils. As he raised a bite to his jaws, it promptly fell from the fork and splattered across his lap. His face turned a bright shade of scarlet.
Excuse me.
It doesn't seem to bother your friend,
Astrid observed. Indeed, it did not. Stu, for his part, had proceeded immediately to stuff and gorge his face, burping and belching without the slightest regard for his surroundings. By now, he wore a snowy white beard of mashed potatoes as he sat back with a satisfied sigh.
I prefer the term impersonal associate.
Elizabeth, a lady to the last, had been considerably quieter. When Adam turned to speak to her, he had to do a double take.
I'm so sorry,
He exclaimed.
I was sure you'd been served. I'll call one of the...
Elizabeth dabbed her mouth with a napkin and shook her head.
There's no need. I was served, and it was very good.
Monster, meanwhile, had long since given up on the social graces. When the seventh splotch of mashed potatoes and gravy plopped onto his lap, he finally lost his temper and proceeded to eat as he always had, face first. A ripple of chuckles passed among the children, and one by one they set their utensils aside and followed suit, prompting many disapproving sighs from their parents. A nearby mouse was heard to murmur,
He really is a monster!
The children roared with laughter when Monster finally lifted his head from his plate, glaring with contempt down at the remains of his dinner, as if gloating over a hated enemy. As if to strike a dying blow against him, the last blob of food dropped from his snout onto his stomach. Astrid giggled faintly.
Is that how you normally do it?
Taking her napkin, she attempted to wipe him clean. Monster glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, grabbed her hand to stop her ministrations, and smirked.
No, the fight usually ends before I eat.
Further down the table, a mouse had raised his cup to take a sip, when he gave a yelp of fright. A pair of large black eyes stared back at him from inside. The cup dropped to the table and rolled off the edge, but didn't spill a single drop. 4 long, slender legs unfolded from the inside, and out staggered Matrix. The spider held his head for a moment, and then crawled in Elizabeth's general direction. Astrid pressed close to Monster. The large mouse raised an eyebrow.
It's only Matrix.
It has a name?
You might say he's our pet.
Matrix raised an arm as if to protest, and then began to jabber incomprehensibly.
I think he's drunk.
Elizabeth observed.
What's in these cups anyway?
Mead, Matthias answered.
And it's made from fermented honey.
Adam clarified.
We keep a hive on the east side.
You keep bees?
Elizabeth asked. Matthias nodded.
With Jormungandr's protection, we can walk openly. This has allowed us to pursue alternate sources of food. We have become self-sufficient.
You could say this feast is in his honor.
Adam added. Elizabeth mused.
Then where is he?
Adam motioned towards the village wall.
Out there, somewhere, keeping watch.
Elizabeth followed Adam's gesture and gazed off into the night.
I wish we had had someone like him back home. He could have saved a lot of lives.
Perhaps, Matthias mumbled. But he is here, and now so are you.
Astrid, meanwhile, was busy tugging on Monster's arm.
This way. I know where you can clean yourself off.
Monster didn't resist. He had actually been waiting for a chance to slip away, and when it presented itself, he eagerly did so. Back in the square, Matrix had broken into an impromptu, gibberish rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody, which faded into the night behind Monster and Astrid as they disappeared down a side street. When the dinner came to its end, the plates, cups, and silverware were gathered up and whisked away to be washed and cleaned. The side tables were folded up and stowed away until the next harvest. With the cleaning done, several young mice then hauled out an odd assortment of instruments, such as guitars, banjos, a set of drums, and even a horn of sorts. As the music started, mice paired up to dance, broke up, and paired up with new partners. The dancing, however, slowed after a time, as the mice backed away to get a better view of a duo that outdid all the others. Stu and Matrix, a shrew and a spider. They opened with a waltz, the lead alternating between the two every few steps. At some point, Stu tripped over one of Matrix's many legs, and the formerly graceful duo switched to what appeared to be a two-man display of breakdancing acrobatics. As the tempo picked up, Stu and Matrix shifted into disco, shaking their hips and pointing skyward. Through it all, the mice oohed and ahed at the performance. That was when Matrix bumped Stu aside with a forceful thrust of his abdomen and broke out into a traditional arachnid courtship display. 2 legs flipped upwards, and he raised his abdomen in the air, shaking it wildly as he skittered from side to side. Unnoticed by the spider, Stu eased back into the limelight, mimicking the spider's motions as best he could. The result was a caricature of an Eastern-style belly dance. The sounds of chuckling alerted Matrix to the fact that not all was right. He noticed the shrew beside him, upstaging his performance, and jealous Matrix was not at all pleased. His motions grew still as he scowled at oblivious Stu, and began tapping a rear limb against the ground, while all 4 forelimbs rested indignantly against his waist. Then Matrix stomped, as forcefully as a spider can stomp, which isn't very, on Stu's foot. It was more of a surprise than anything, but it was enough to stop Stu and get his attention.
Hey, what was that for?
Matrix jabbered angrily back at Stu in response.
Oh yeah? Well, so's your mama!
There was a collective gasp all around them. Matrix gave an angry growl, "Rawr!" and raised all 4 forelimbs in a classic boxing stance.
Okay, tough guy,
Stu barked, raising his fists in answer.
put 'em up. I'll give y'all 5 across the lips.
He paused a moment in thought.
Or I would, if y'all had lips.
A wave of laughter passed through the crowd. Elizabeth, however, did not join in. She was busy hiding her face under her cloak in shame. Matrix dropped all pretense and simply pounced on Stu, drawing a surprised yelp from the shrew. The 2 scuffled on the ground, like 2 young boys quarreling in a schoolyard. Gustav, the blacksmith, then added self-appointed bouncer to his resume. He stalked into the middle of the dance floor and seized up the squabbling spider and shrew by the scruff of their necks, or exoskeletons, as the case may be. Neither of them appeared to notice that they were no longer on the ground. They didn't stop batting their limbs back and forth either, until Gustav dumped the 2 in a nearby water trough.
That's enough from you 2.
Stu and Matrix, meanwhile, sputtered for breath as they regained their footing and hung listlessly over the side of the trough.
Truce?
Stu asked. Matrix answered. The 2 then shook hands, or various equivalents, and crawled back out. Upon his return, Monster was quite taken aback at the scene of disorder before him. So many bodies swayed together, in harmony perhaps, yet in such an intricate pattern as to leave his mind swimming.
Oh, they've started.
Astrid exclaimed. She tugged eagerly on Monster's arm.
Come on, they're playing my favorite song.
Monster, however, resisted.
I've never danced before.
Astrid shot Monster a curious look.
You've never eaten with silverware? And you've never danced? By thunder, what have you done?
I fight a lot.
Astrid's face immediately brightened.
Well then, think of it as fighting. Fighting in time with the music.
Fight is nothing like a dance.
Monster began to say, but the words died in his throat as he saw Astrid take hold of his arms in both hands and heave with all the might of her tiny body. Though he could have held his ground all night, Monster finally relented. There was something very endearing in Astrid's enthusiasm. Then there were those bright, eager eyes looking up at him. Elizabeth watched in amazement as the 2 mice stepped into the town square. Monster towered above all the other occupants and dwarfed his petite partner with his sheer height. But that wasn't the thing that surprised Elizabeth the most.
He can dance?
She exclaimed.
Right, of course he can. He's quick and agile. He should be a natural.
Adam broke out in a broad smile as he watched.
I never could join in.
He mused. Elizabeth looked back to Adam, her own smile fading as she laid eyes on his crutch.
But you know, watching your friend, it almost makes up for it.
How?
Elizabeth asked. Adam turned to her, a strangely serene expression on his face.
We have had a great deal in common. When I look at him, it could just as easily be me. Your fate had been kinder, at least.
Elizabeth chewed on her lip in thought. Then a decisive light flickered into her eye, and she stood up.
Come with me.
To dance?
Even in his seat, Adam wobbled frantically.
But I don't even have 2 left feet. I can't dance.
We'll do a waltz.
Elizabeth offered.
I'll lead. Just hold on to me, and I'll try to hold you up.
The color drained from Adam's terrified face. Yet the pale color was accompanied by a euphoric grin. He wobbled to his feet and leaned on his crutch, just long enough to reach the dance floor. And then he leaned into Elizabeth's shoulder for the first dance of his life. At first, Adam shook in terror as he glanced frantically over Elizabeth's shoulder. He could just imagine the derisive chuckles of the other mice as they watched him stumble about on his weak leg. Yet, as he felt Elizabeth's heartbeat against his own, felt her strength supporting his weakness, he found himself growing steadier and more confident in his own movements. The world around them faded from Adam's senses as he found himself looking into Elizabeth's face. She smiled back at him. Adam blinked, the corners of his own mouth tugging upwards. And nothing else mattered. Nothing but Elizabeth. She became his world, and all in that world became right. Outside the village walls, Peter had abandoned his work on the scale. Other things now swirled through his mind. With his heart no longer in his work, he took to the one thing that always helped him make sense of his troubles: his writing. The page was illuminated by a small light bulb, which Peter kept clenched in his teeth. Small threads of electricity surged from his mouth into the bulb, providing the energy to maintain its flickering life. He opened, as always, addressing his fresh letter to its intended recipient. Dear Dr. Valencia, today I have suffered a terrible setback. We have come across a fascinating culture of wild mice, hidden away in a world I could scarcely have imagined. They have proven remarkably accepting of my companions, but not of me. I'm afraid I lost my temper earlier, and I said things of you and the gifts you gave me that I have come to regret. I am sorry, Doctor. If not for you, I would still be in a cage, somewhere, oblivious and thoughtless. Peter paused in silence. On second thought, no, I am not sorry. Because of your work, I have suffered greatly. Your gifts have also proven to be curses, and I believe myself quite justified in questioning whether or not I am truly better off with them. In the flickering light of his bulb, Peter could see the numbers branded into his arm. He held it under the light, staring down at them, and silently reading out each one to himself. The light bulb went dark as Peter took it from his mouth and set it down beside him. Despite being hot from the night's work, Peter pulled his jacket on, covering the number under his sleeve. Peter heaved a sigh and closed his eyes. In the black of night, he could hear the sounds of revelry from within the village and smell the fresh-baked bread, something he once thought beyond the reach of any mouse, and hot teas, ripe, buttered corn, roasted nuts, and other scents far beyond his memory. He heard laughter and music, the sounds of dancing, the murmur of stories being told. They were the sounds of a world close at hand, just on the other side of a closed gate, but a world far beyond his reach. And there was the sound of breathing. Peter's eyes snapped open. Somewhere in the darkness behind him, he heard something breathing, low, dry, like a desert wind. There was a rustling in the grass, and a smell not unlike dry fish. Peter stood up, arming himself with one of the rods Gustav had provided. "Is someone out there?" he called out. He was answered with a malicious wind, blowing through the grass and carrying with it a putrid stench of rot. Peter hopped down from the scale, the light bulb held in his free hand, suddenly growing bright in his grasp. It cast a sphere of illumination ahead, stopping just at the edge of the towering grasses. "How is it?" The green blades rattled in the night as another breeze swept through them. "What foreign magics you bring, Peter Dane?" "Not magic," Peter answered, holding his light aloft. "Science." The voice whispered, and shifted away to the left, to the other side of the scale. "What is magic, Peter Dane, but knowledge unknown, hidden?" "You have me at a disadvantage. You know who I am, and you see me. I hear only a voice." "As it should be." "So you prefer to be unknown?" "Unknown to you, Peter Dane. Known to my subjects. Magic to you, science to them." "And what are you?" "I am Matthias, and Matthias is me." Peter scoffed. "I hardly doubt that. Matthias currently dines with the other mice." "And I dine out here. We're unparalleled, he and I." "Do you now?" Peter hopped atop the scale, and jamming the tip of the light bulb in his mouth, he took his rod in both hands. "From Matthias I take speed and agility." As if to emphasize the point, there came a sound like a whip cracking. When next the voice spoke, it was behind Peter. "From me, Matthias takes patience and longevity, strength and serenity." Peter whirled about. He saw no more than a shadow as it retreated into the darkness. There was a sound like wind, weaving through the grass, just beyond Peter's range of vision. Peter crouched low against the scale, and every nerve in his body wound tightly and ready to spring. The thing, whatever it was silent, save for the sounds of breathing. Peter let the light bulb drop and fade into blackness. Long and silent, Peter waited as he listened intently for the sounds of motion. Then it came, a scraping, as of thousands of blades digging into the dust. A putrid wind burst forth from the left, and Peter whirled about, striking every bit as swiftly as his adversary. There was a low electric hum, and a burst of sparks as Peter thrust his rod into the void. In the dim flash, he saw fangs and a gaping maw. Matthias let out a shriek of agony, clutching at his forehead as he doubled over in his chair. The music stopped. The dancing came to a sudden halt. All eyes turned to stare in shock and terror at Matthias on his throne. For a time, Matthias remained seated, whimpering, rubbing his aching jaws, smoke issuing from between his teeth in thin wisps. Adam gave a shout and scrambled for the remaining table, despite his crippled leg. Elizabeth followed after, supporting Adam on her shoulder. They were joined shortly by Gustav.
"It's nothing," Matthias insisted. Just a spasm. I need to rest."
Matthias rose from his seat and staggered away to his quarters, assisted by Gustav.
"Carry on, my people."
The mice that remained behind, however, weren't in much of a dancing mood after the unexpected disruption. The musicians continued playing for a time in a vain effort to keep everyone's spirits up, but the life had gone out of their music. It sounded hollow and distant, and no one felt an inclination to go on celebrating. One by one, the mice left the square, retreating to their homes for an uneasy night. Finally, even the musicians packed up and slunk home, leaving 6 final figures in an oppressive silence. Stu and Matrix shook as they clung to each other. Astrid squeezed close to Monster's side, and Adam's strong leg wobbled under his weight.
Wait, we should get inside,
Adam whispered.
I take it this isn't normal?
Elizabeth asked. Adam shook his head.
It's a bad sign, possibly the worst. I can explain later, but for now, we need to get inside.
Elizabeth nodded to Monster and Stu. Matrix, on the other hand, skittered away into the dark, making for the village gate, and Peter. Stu immediately rushed after Elizabeth and Adam, but as Monster moved to follow, he felt Astrid hold him all the tighter.
Don't leave me.
She whimpered.
I don't want to be alone. Not tonight.
Come with us,
Adam suggested. For just a moment, Astrid stared at him. The look in her eye was almost cold. Then she looked up at Monster, and the huge mouse nodded down to her.
Fine. Let's go.